At 5:40 on a September morning, Ruth Calder stepped onto her back porch and knew something was wrong before she saw a single thing. Red Hollow was quiet, not peaceful, quiet. For 20 years, Ruth had measured harvest season by sound. Diesel engines coughing awake before sunrise, grain trucks groaning along County Road 8, tractors working distant fields while porch lights were still burning. That morning, there was nothing. No engines, no trucks, no machinery, only the slow creak of the barn behind her and the heavy, patient knock of hooves against old wooden boards. Ruth crossed the yard with her coffee cooling between both hands. Inside the barn, 22 draft horses were already awake. Big shoulders shifted beneath worn coats. Harness chains clicked softly. One gray gelding pushed his nose over the stall door, waiting for breakfast as though the outside world had not changed at all. Then Ruth heard gravel crunching near the road. A pickup turned into her drive, then another, then 3 more. By 6 o'clock, 7 trucks were parked beyond her gate. The first belonged to a dairy farmer whose bulk tank generator was running low. Behind him waited an orchard owner with fruit that needed hauling before afternoon heat. Farther back stood 2 men Ruth clearly remembered from an auction 6 months earlier. They had laughed harder than most. Neither one laughed now. Ruth walked toward the gate. No one seemed eager to be the first to speak. Then another truck appeared at the end of the road. Black, polished, expensive. Ruth recognized it immediately. Everett Shaw, the biggest custom farmer in the county. The man who owned more machinery than some dealerships. The man who had once looked across an auction ring at Ruth and told an entire crowd that she was buying 22 mouths that would eat her broke. Now one of Everett's tractors sat useless 3 miles away with an empty diesel tank. His pickup stopped at the end of the line. Behind Ruth, one of the old horses stamped once inside the barn. 6 months earlier, nobody had wanted them. That morning, half the county was waiting at her gate, and Ruth remembered exactly where it had started. 6 months earlier, Ruth Calder had not gone to the auction looking for horses. She had gone because a logging outfit north of Red Hollow was shutting down after 3 generations, and somebody told her there might be cheap fencing, wagon hardware, maybe a used water tank worth dragging home. By noon, most of the useful equipment was already gone. What remained stood in the far holding pens. 22 draft horses, Belgians, Percheron crosses, 2 grays gone nearly white around the eyes, and several massive geldings with the thick knees and scarred shoulders of animals that had worked for a living. Most were old, not dying, not crippled, just old enough that nobody in the crowd could imagine a profitable reason to own them. Ruth understood the arithmetic. 22 horses meant hay every day whether they worked or not. Farrier bills, veterinary care, fencing strong enough to hold animals weighing nearly a ton. And unlike tractors, they could not simply be parked behind a shed until somebody needed them. Everett Shaw was leaning against the auction rail when the horses were brought forward. He had spent the morning buying hydraulic attachments for less than half their retail price, and he looked almost offended when the auctioneer asked for an opening bid on the herd. 22 mouths, Everett said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Eating money before breakfast. A few men laughed. Ruth did not. She was already turning toward the exit when one of the handlers tried moving 2 bays through a side gate. The lead horse hesitated. Its partner shifted with it. Not after the rope tightened. Before. The first stepped left. The second matched the movement immediately, shoulders staying almost perfectly aligned. Ruth stopped walking. The handler pulled again. Both horses back together. Same rhythm, same distance. No panic, no fighting the pressure. Something old stirred in Ruth's memory. She stepped closer to the fence. Without thinking, she said a word she had not used in years. Whoa. Both horses stopped. The handler looked at her. So did Everett. For 1 second, Ruth was no longer standing beside an auction pen. She was 17 again, watching her father work a pair of Belgians behind their barn. Then came the memory she usually pushed away. 2 empty stalls. her father rolling up an old set of lines. Ruth had been the one who convinced him to sell his last team. They needed money. The tractor was faster. The farm had survived because of that decision. She had never regretted the logic. Only the silence in the barn afterward. The auctioneer called for a bid. Nothing. He dropped the price. Still nothing. Everett glanced toward Ruth and smiled. You can't feed a farm with nostalgia, Ruth. This time the laughter was louder. Ruth looked again at the two bays, then at the other horses standing behind them. Some tired, some stiff, but watching, waiting, as if they still expected somebody to ask them to work. Ruth raised her bidder card. The laughter died for half a second before coming back twice as hard. Nobody bid against her. When the gavel fell, Ruth Calder owned 22 old draft horses she had never planned to buy. Then the auctioneer leaned across his stand. One more thing, Mrs. Calder. Ruth looked up. Property changes hands tomorrow. He pointed toward the pens. Every one of them has to be gone by noon. Only then did Ruth understand that buying the horses had been the easy part. Ruth spent the drive home doing arithmetic she already knew would not work. 22 horses, less than 24 hours, one old stock trailer, 2 usable paddocks, and nowhere near enough hay. By the time she pulled into her yard, she had called every neighbor within 10 miles who owned something capable of hauling livestock. Most said no. A few laughed. One man told her the horses would cost more to move than she had paid for them. He was probably right. By sunset, Ruth had managed to borrow 2 trailers, hire another, and convince a retired cattle hauler to make one last run before dark. The first load arrived after 9. The horses stepped down stiffly, snorting into the cold night air, their breath hanging white beneath the barn lights. Ruth had expected chaos. Instead, most of them stood quietly once they were unloaded. But when she tried separating one large chestnut gelding from a darker horse beside him, everything changed. The chestnut threw his head. The darker horse spun toward the gate. For several seconds, both animals fought the handlers harder than they had fought anything all day. Easy, Ruth said, pulling the lead rope shorter. The chestnut nearly dragged her sideways. Don't fight him. The voice came from behind her. An old man stood outside the barn door, wearing a faded canvas coat and a cap stained dark along the brim. Ruth recognized Walter Keene before he stepped into the light. Years earlier, Walter had worked teams with her father during logging season. She had not seen him in months. What are you doing here? Heard you bought yourself a problem. Ruth almost smiled. Walter pointed at the second horse. Put him back. Ruth frowned. What? Put them together. She did. The moment the darker horse came alongside the chestnut, both animals settled. Not gradually, immediately. Walter watched them for a long moment. Matched pair. Ruth looked at him. You can tell that from one tantrum? I can tell they're used to knowing where the other one is. He walked past her, toward the rest of the horses. One by one, he studied their feet, shoulders, old harness marks, and the way they shifted when people moved around them. Ruth followed. So? She asked. Walter did not answer right away. Finally, he said, You bought 22 horses. I know what I bought. No, you know how many. That irritated her. I didn't bring them here to turn this place into some kind of museum. Walter stopped walking. Good. He looked toward the chestnut pair. Because those aren't museum horses. The next morning, the bills started. Hay, minerals, a veterinarian, farrier work on feet that had gone too long without proper trimming. Temporary fencing where Ruth's old wire was too weak. Every time she solved one problem, another one appeared behind it. By the third day, she had spent almost everything she had set aside for spring planting, and the horses still had not earned $1. That evening, Walter returned. He walked into the paddock carrying no whip, no feed bucket, only an old set of lines Ruth had found hanging in the back of her barn. He approached the 2 bays Ruth had noticed at the auction. Watch their feet, he told her. Walter gave a quiet command. The horses backed together. Another command. They stepped right. Then stopped. No pulling. No confusion. Walter lowered the lines. Ruth stared at the pair. Walter did not smile. Some of these horses remember more about working than you do. And for the first time since the auction, Ruth wondered if she had bought something very different from what everyone thought. Walter came back the next morning before Ruth had finished feeding. He brought an old leather harness over one shoulder and a wooden doubletree under his arm. Ruth looked at the cracked straps. "You trust that?" "No." Walter dropped it onto a fence post. "That's why we inspect it first." For the next hour, he showed Ruth what time had erased from her hands. He checked the stitching, ran his fingers beneath the collar, measured where the weight would sit against the shoulders, tested buckles that had not moved in years. Then he chose the same bay pair Ruth had noticed at the auction. They stood side by side while Walter fitted the harness. Neither horse danced away, neither fought the collar. When Walter lifted the lines, both animals raised their heads as if some forgotten part of the morning had finally returned. "Back," he said. They stepped backward together. "Gee." Both shifted right. "Haw." Left. Then Walter clicked his tongue and asked them forward. They moved at the same pace, shoulder to shoulder, keeping the traces almost equally tight. Ruth followed beside them. "They still know all that?" Walter glanced at her. "You don't forget 10 years of work, because nobody asks you to do it for 6 months." That was the first thing Ruth had misunderstood. The second was assuming the 22 horses were equally useful. They were not. Some responded quickly, others hesitated. A gray mare knew how to stand perfectly still while equipment moved behind her, but tired after only a short walk. One massive Belgian gelding had tremendous strength, but became anxious when separated from a smaller sorrel. Another pair could back toward a wagon tongue with almost no guidance at all. Walter kept notes, not on value, on memory, which horses matched, which commands they recognized, which shoulders needed time, which feet required correction before any serious pulling. By the end of the week, Ruth began seeing the herd differently. At the auction, she had seen 22 old horses. Now she saw pairs, habits, experience, years of repetition stored inside muscle and behavior. And that discovery made her impatient, too impatient. One cool morning after several days of light work, Ruth hitched 2 geldings to a stone boat loaded with split firewood. Walter looked at the load. "Take half off. They pulled more than this yesterday. For 20 minutes. They're fine." Walter studied her. Ruth. But she was already gathering the lines. The geldings leaned into their collars. The sled moved. For the first few minutes, Ruth felt vindicated. The horses settled into a steady rhythm, hooves biting into the packed earth, breath rolling from their nostrils. They completed one trip, then another. Ruth added a little more wood. By the third run, Walter stepped in front of the team. "That's enough. They've still got plenty." "That isn't the question." Ruth stopped only because arguing would take longer. The next morning, one gelding refused to lean properly into his collar. Walter found the tender spot high on the shoulder almost immediately. Not a serious injury, but enough. The horse would rest for days. Ruth stood beside the stall feeling worse than the small injury justified. She had wanted so badly to prove the horses could still work that she had nearly turned them into the very thing Everett believed they were, something to use until the numbers stopped making sense. Walter closed the stall door. "Old knowledge isn't magic," he said. "You can ruin a good horse just as fast with nostalgia as you can with ignorance." Ruth said nothing. Outside, 21 other horses waited in the morning sun. She had begun to understand what they remembered. Now she had to learn what they could endure. And when she checked her feed account that afternoon, she realized she might not have much time to learn it. Walter found the other half of Ruth's 22 horses beneath a tarp in the back of her father's barn. Not more horses, everything required to make horses useful. He had been searching for a spare clevis when he pulled an old wooden box away from the wall. Underneath it were harness parts, lines, rusted buckles, eveners and collars that had not carried weight in years. Ruth stood in the doorway. "Most of that is junk. Walter looked over his shoulder. Some of it is. He lifted a brass hame cap, almost brown beneath the tarnish. Ruth recognized it. Her father used to polish it on Sunday evenings. I thought that was gone. Walter rubbed his thumb across the metal. It almost was. He found an old cloth and began cleaning it. The brass slowly caught the light again. They spent the next several days deciding what deserved saving. Walter had no patience for nostalgia. Cracked leather went into the trash. Weak stitching was replaced. Bent hardware was repaired only when it could be trusted. Anything unsafe was discarded no matter who had owned it. That was when Ruth understood something she had missed at the auction. The horses were only half the system. The rest lived in collars fitted correctly, lines used by hands that understood them, eveners that distributed a load, wagons somebody still knew how to repair, and dozens of small skills that seemed useless right up until nobody remembered them anymore. By the following week, Ruth began using that system. Carefully, the bays hauled fence posts to the north pasture. The chestnuts dragged storm-fallen limbs from the creek. A gray pair moved feed sacks between barns. Another team carried produce crates from field to packing shed. Nobody pretended they were faster than Ruth's tractor. They were not. That was no longer the question. At the end of the week, Ruth checked her fuel log, then checked it again. Diesel consumption had fallen. Not enough to pay for 22 horses. Not enough to prove Everett wrong, but enough for Ruth to realize the animals could earn back part of what keeping them cost. That afternoon, Everett slowed his pickup beside the road. Ruth was driving the bays past the barn. He rolled down his window. "What year are you planning to farm in, Ruth?" She kept the team moving. Everett laughed and drove away. An hour later, Ruth's fuel dealer called. She expected confirmation of her next delivery. Instead, he told her it might arrive late. How late? Don't know yet. Terminal problem. Couple things backed up. Probably temporary. Ruth looked through the window. The brass hame cap Walter had cleaned now hung from a repaired harness near the barn door. Outside, 22 horses stood chewing in the afternoon light. The dealer repeated himself. Probably temporary. Ruth opened her notebook and wrote down the delivery date. Then she circled it twice. The horses had already shown her that old things could still work. She had no idea how soon the rest of Red Hollow would need that lesson. By early summer, the horses no longer looked like animals people had abandoned at an auction. Their coats had filled out. Their shoulders carried muscle again. Their feet were sounder, and every improvement made them more expensive to keep. Healthy draft horses ate. A lot. Every morning Ruth watched hay disappear into 22 mouths and understood why Everett's joke had worked so well. He had not been entirely wrong. Feed prices were climbing. Farrier work came due again. 2 harnesses needed repairs. The diesel Ruth had saved was real, but it still did not come close to paying for the herd. Then the offers began. A carriage operator wanted 4 of the calmest horses. A logger wanted the bays and the chestnuts. His offer would have covered months of feed. Ruth found Walter repairing a trace strap. "If I sell 4, the other 18 get easier to keep." "That's true." She waited. "And?" Walter looked up. "Which 4?" she told him. His expression changed. "Your 2 best matched teams. They're also worth the most." "Exactly." Ruth frowned. "They're horses, Walter. 22 isn't some sacred number." "I never said it was." He nodded toward the bays. "You're still looking at 4 horses." "I'm looking at 2 teams." The distinction bothered her because she understood it now. Strength could be bought. Years of learning another animal's pace, pressure, hesitation, and movement could not be replaced nearly as quickly. Ruth turned down both offers. 3 days later, the hay supplier raised his price. That night she spread invoices across the kitchen table until one piece of equipment kept pulling her eyes back. A nearly new hydraulic attachment she had barely used in 2 years. She had bought it during the period when every improvement on the farm seemed to mean another piece of machinery. On Saturday morning, a buyer backed his trailer beside the machine shed. Ruth stood there while the attachment disappeared up the ramps. When the truck pulled away, It left a clean rectangular space in the dust. She stared at the empty spot longer than she meant to. Then an older image came back. 2 empty horse stalls, her father standing between them, rolling up the lines after Ruth had convinced him to sell his last team so they could afford a tractor. Back then, the empty stalls had meant progress. Now she was looking at empty space where machinery had been, so she could afford to feed horses. For one uncomfortable moment, Ruth wondered whether she had learned anything at all. Maybe she was not correcting an old mistake. Maybe she was simply making the same mistake in reverse. Walter found her at the fence that evening. "You regret selling it?" "I don't know." That's usually what a real decision feels like. The radio inside the barn interrupted them. A refinery disruption had begun affecting regional diesel distribution. Deliveries might be delayed. Prices were expected to rise. Across the county, Everett Shaw told a local reporter it would pass. A few days, maybe a week. Ruth wanted him to be right. Before going inside, she walked to her fuel tank and tapped the gauge. Then she looked toward the 22 horses grazing beyond it. For the first time, she did not see old replacing new. She saw 2 kinds of risk, and she still did not know which one she had chosen. The first farm to run out of diesel belonged to a man who had laughed at Ruth from 3 rows behind Everett Shaw. His name was Dale Mercer. He showed up just after sunrise with mud on his boots and embarrassment written across his face. Ruth saw him standing beside the barn before he said anything. "What happened?" Dale removed his cap. "My tank's dry." Ruth waited. He looked toward the horses. A weather front was moving in from the west, and nearly 300 bales of hay were still sitting in his lower field. If the rain reached them first, weeks of work could be lost. Dale swallowed. Could they move it? Ruth looked at Walter. Walter looked at the sky. Then he asked the question that mattered. How far? By 8 o'clock, Ruth had 2 teams harnessed. The bays took the first wagon. The chestnuts took the second. It was slower than a tractor. Everyone there knew that. A tractor could have moved the same hay in a fraction of the time. But the tractor sitting beside Dale's machine shed had an empty fuel tank. The horses did not. Ruth drove the first team while Walter handled the second. They moved steadily. Load, haul, unload, water, rest. Again. By noon, clouds had swallowed half the western sky. Dale started pushing. Can we skip the break? No. We're losing light. They're losing heat. Ruth loosened a collar and checked the bay gelding's shoulder. Dale stared at the field. For a moment, Ruth could see the old judgment returning to his face. A machine would not need water. A machine would not need rest. But a machine needed diesel. So he waited. They finished the final load less than 20 minutes before the rain arrived. The first drop struck the barn roof as Ruth backed the empty wagon under cover. Dale stood there watching water darken the yard. Then he reached into his pocket and held out more cash than they had agreed on. Ruth counted the original amount and handed the rest back. You saved my hay. The horses moved your hay. That's what I mean. Ruth shook her head. No, it matters. Dale looked at the teams standing quietly beneath the shed roof. 6 months earlier, he had seen 22 expensive mouths. Now 2 of them had just protected most of his winter feed. That evening, Ruth returned home wet, exhausted, and more hopeful than she wanted to admit. The phone rang before she could remove her boots. It was the fuel dealer. She expected another delay. Instead, he said, Ruth, I figured you should hear it from me. Her hand tightened around the receiver. The next shipment isn't late. He paused. It's been canceled. By the end of the week, Red Hollow had stopped asking whether the fuel shortage was real. Now they were asking who still had diesel. What had begun as a refinery disruption had moved down the supply chain faster than anyone expected. Terminal allocations tightened. 2 scheduled bulk deliveries disappeared from the calendar. Dealers began limiting what they could sell, and every farmer with a private tank suddenly became careful about what was left inside it. At first, the tractors did not all stop at once. They disappeared from the fields one by one. A loader sat beside a hay barn for 2 days. A tractor stopped near County Road 8 with its disc still lowered. A combine remained parked behind a grain shed while the crop around it kept ripening. Then Wednesday morning came. Ruth drove toward the cooperative just after sunrise. For 6 miles, every tractor she passed sat exactly where it had been the evening before. One stood halfway across a field. Another waited beside a wagon that had never been unloaded. A third had stopped with its tracks ending cleanly in the dirt, as though somebody had drawn a line across Red Hollow and told the machines not to cross it. What Ruth noticed most was not what she saw. It was what she could no longer hear. Harvest country was not supposed to be this quiet. Back at the farm, her phone rang at 6:12. An orchard owner needed crates hauled out of the lower rows. At 6:40, a dairy farmer asked whether a team could move feed from a storage barn. At 7:05, somebody Ruth barely knew wanted to know if her horses could pull a wagon 6 miles down a county road. By 8, 4 messages were waiting. By noon, there were 11. Walter stood at the kitchen counter while Ruth wrote names into the notebook that had once been used mostly for feed bills. "Say no," he said. "I am saying no. You've said yes 6 times. They're short jobs." Walter looked toward the barn. There are no short jobs when everybody wants one. Only 14 of the 22 horses were conditioned for serious work. Some could not be separated from their partners. The gray mare could handle light hauling but not hills. The chestnuts were due a rest day. The bays had worked Dale Mercer's place only 2 days earlier. 22 horses had suddenly become valuable. That did not make them unlimited. The calls kept coming. One farmer offered double Ruth's rate if she would cancel somebody else. Another offered triple. She refused both. Then a small dairy west of town called. Their cattle had less than a day of feed left in the barn. Ruth looked at Walter. "Chestnuts," he said. "Light wagon. 2 trips." They were halfway through harnessing when another pickup entered the drive. Then another. By late afternoon, Ruth's yard looked like a sale barn. Men who had laughed 6 months earlier now stood watching Walter fit collars onto horses nobody had wanted. One of them said quietly, "Never thought I'd see this again." For one brief moment, Ruth felt it. Vindication. The county needed what she had saved. Then Walter handed her the list. Ruth counted the jobs. There were more farms asking for help than the teams could possibly reach. And terminal allocations had just been cut again. What should have felt like victory suddenly looked like another kind of danger. Because if Ruth tried to save every farm that called, the first thing the shortage would destroy might be the horses themselves. One name still had not appeared in her notebook, Everett Shaw. And for the first time all week, Ruth was grateful for something she had not received. For the first few days, Ruth told herself she was managing it. She made schedules, marked rest periods, matched light teams to light jobs, and kept the strongest horses for the farms with the steepest roads. Every evening, she crossed names out of her notebook and added new ones beneath them. But the calls multiplied faster than she could erase them. A dairy needed silage moved before morning. An orchard had fruit softening in the heat. A neighbor had fencing supplies stranded 5 miles from where cattle had broken through. Every request sounded reasonable by itself. That was the problem. Ruth began saying yes because she could picture what happened when she said no. Walter noticed before she did. On Thursday morning, he found Ruth harnessing the bay team, even though their names were marked rest in thick pencil. They worked yesterday. 4 hours. 5.5. They're just hauling feed today. Walter reached over and tapped the notebook. "You wrote rest. I also wrote Jensen Dairy. Jensen will still have cows tomorrow. He might not have feed." Walter stared at her. "So everybody's emergency becomes theirs?" Ruth tightened the buckle. "Until the fuel comes back, somebody has to help." Walter said nothing more. That silence irritated her worse than an argument. The Bays worked Jensen's place that morning. Then Ruth took them directly to another farm because a promised team had gone lame. She told herself the second job was only 2 miles. The road was flat. The load was light. They could handle it. By late afternoon, Ruth noticed the off stride. Just once. The left gelding shortened a step. Then again, she stopped the wagon. Walter climbed down before she could speak. He ran his hand along the horse's shoulder and pressed near the collar line. The gelding flinched. Ruth felt her stomach drop. How bad? Sore. Walter unbuckled the trace. Maybe nothing serious if we stop now. Ruth looked at the half-loaded wagon. We're less than a mile out. Walter turned toward her. No, they're waiting on this feed. No, we can walk them slow. Walter's face changed. Not anger at first. Something closer to disappointment. You hear yourself? Ruth went still. Walter pointed at the horse. You spent 6 months telling everybody these animals weren't machines. His voice hardened. Now the whole county wants them, and you're starting to treat them exactly like machines. That landed harder than she expected. Ruth looked at the gelding's darkened shoulder beneath the collar. 6 months earlier, Everett had seen 22 mouths that cost money. Then the county had begun seeing 22 engines that did not need diesel. Ruth had thought both views were wrong, and somewhere in the last week, she had started making the same mistake from the other direction. Output, schedules, loads. One more job, one more mile, one more reason not to stop. Walter removed the harness completely. The remaining feed went nowhere that evening. Ruth canceled the next morning's jobs, then the afternoon jobs. By sunrise, people were already angry. One farmer accused her of taking advantage of the shortage. Another said she had no right to sit on 22 working horses, while other farms suffered. Ruth almost laughed at the cruelty of it. When nobody needed the horses, she had been foolish for feeding them. Now that everyone needed them, she was selfish for letting them rest. She closed the notebook. For the first time since the shortage began, Ruth wondered whether saving the horses had only created a different way to fail them. Then gravel cracked beneath tires outside. A black pickup stopped beside the barn. Walter looked through the window. Ruth did not need to. She already knew who it was. Everett Shaw had finally come to ask for help. Everett Shaw did not come into the barn right away. He stood beside his pickup with both hands in his coat pockets, looking past Ruth toward the horses. For once, he did not have anything clever to say. Ruth walked out to meet him. What do you need? Everett glanced toward Walter, then back at her. 4 teams. Ruth almost laughed. 4? For as long as this shortage lasts. That could be weeks. I know. Everett reached into his truck and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He handed it to her. Ruth looked at the number written at the bottom, then looked again. It was enough to cover months of hay. Enough to clear the farrier account. Enough to replace the money she had burned through since the auction. Enough that she would not have to lie awake wondering whether keeping 22 horses had ruined her farm. What's the catch? No catch. Walter stepped closer. Everett added, exclusive use. There it was. Ruth looked up. You want all the conditioned teams. I want the ones that can work. For your operation only. I'm paying for priority. No, you're paying for everybody else to lose access. Everett's jaw tightened. My operation feeds half this county. And Jensen's cows stop eating because you own more acres? This isn't charity, Ruth. No. She folded the paper once. That's the first thing you've said we agree on. Everett took a slow breath. You think those horses will still be here in January if you keep playing rescue wagon for every small farmer with an empty tank? Ruth said nothing. He pointed toward the barn. You need feed, shoes, labor, vet bills. You know exactly what those animals cost. He did not have to remind her. That was what made the offer dangerous. If Everett had offered too little, refusing would have been easy. If he had insulted her, easier still. Instead, he had offered exactly what fear had been whispering she needed. Security. Ruth looked at the paper again. For a moment she saw the winter hay stacked high enough to stop worrying. She saw the account balance finally above zero. She saw herself telling Walter they had made it. Then she pictured Dale Mercer standing in the rain after those first loads of hay, the dairy west of town, the calls she had not been able to answer, and the bay gelding inside the barn with a sore shoulder because she had already pushed too hard trying to become everyone's solution. Ruth handed the offer back. Everett stared at her. "You didn't even think about it." "I did. Not long enough. Long enough to know 4 teams don't belong to the highest bidder just because diesel got scarce." His expression hardened. "You're going to regret that." "Probably." Walter looked at her. Ruth continued, "But I'll still send you horses." Everett frowned. "What? You go on the schedule. I'm not waiting behind people farming 40 acres. You're waiting behind whatever job cannot wait." He gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "You're serious. Dairy feed before field preparation. Livestock water before hauling lumber. Perishable crops before anything that can sit another day. And who decides that? I do." The silence between them was different from the silence at the auction. Back then, Everett had owned the room. Ruth had owned nothing but a bidder card and a decision nobody respected. Now he stood in her yard, asking for access to animals he had once called 22 mouths eating money. Everett folded the offer and put it back in his pocket. "When can I have a team?" Ruth opened her notebook. "Tomorrow afternoon." "That late?" "That's when you're up." He looked as though no one had told him that in years. The next day, Everett was waiting beside one of his largest tractors when Ruth arrived with the chestnut team. The tractor sat motionless, its fuel gauge nearly empty. Walter climbed down from the wagon and checked the collars. Morning sun caught the polished brass hame cap on the lead horse. For an instant, Ruth remembered the auction, Everett leaning against the rail. "You can't feed a farm with nostalgia." She did not repeat the words. She did not have to. The horses leaned into their collars, the wagon moved, and Everett stepped aside to let them pass. By the second week of the shortage, Ruth had learned the lesson nobody wanted to hear. 22 horses were not enough. They could move feed, haul produce, pull wagons, carry fencing supplies, handle certain field jobs, but they could not replace every tractor sitting still across Red Hollow. Whenever someone pretended otherwise, the horses paid for it. So Ruth stopped trying to save every job. Instead, she began sorting them. On the kitchen wall, she hung a sheet of brown paper and drew 3 columns. Horses, fuel, can wait. Walter stood beside her. Orchard crates? Horses. Deep tillage at Miller's? Fuel. Fence posts? Horses. Combine work? Ruth stared at him. Walter shrugged. Just checking. For the first time in days, she laughed. The system was simple, because it had to be. Remaining diesel went to the jobs where machinery truly mattered. The horses took shorter hauls, feed movement, wagon work, and the routes where speed mattered less than simply being able to keep moving. Farmers started sharing loads. A wagon delivering feed east brought empty barrels west, instead of returning empty. Neighbors combined trips. Nothing about it looked modern. Nothing about it looked old-fashioned either. It simply worked. One afternoon, Ruth and Walter stood beside a fence watching 2 systems operate at the same time. Across the field, a tractor pulled a heavy implement through the soil. Along the county road, a horse team moved seed sacks toward another farm. Walter rested his arms on the fence. Your father would have hated that, Ruth smiled. The tractor? No. He nodded toward the horses. He would have tried to make them do the tractor's job. Ruth turned toward him. Walter kept watching the field. He loved horses, sometimes enough to forget why people bought machines. That surprised her. For months, Ruth had assumed Walter believed the old ways had been better, simply because they were old. He glanced at her. And your generation got so good at replacing everything that required patience, you forgot some of those things were still useful. The tractor passed the end of the field and turned. The horse team continued down the road. Neither one stopped for the other. A memory came back to Ruth. She was 12. Her father was standing beside a broken baler while she waited for him to start swearing. Instead, he had smiled. Never let one broken thing stop the whole farm. For years, Ruth thought he had been talking about spare parts. Now, watching the tractor disappear behind the hill while hoofbeats continued along the road, she finally understood why he had never said machine. That evening she wrote the sentence at the top of her notebook. The phone rang before she closed it. County office. Fuel reserves were lower than expected. An emergency meeting had been called for morning. Every major agricultural operator in Red Hollow was expected to attend. Ruth looked at the notebook, then toward the barn. For months, people had laughed at the choices she made. Tomorrow, those same people were going to sit in one room and ask how much of the county could still move. The county meeting started at 8 in the morning and ran out of chairs by 8:10. Farmers stood along the back wall. Feed suppliers leaned against windowsills. 2 dairy operators argued quietly near the door about who had been promised the last 50 gallons of diesel from a private tank west of town. The room smelled like coffee, wet jackets, and the kind of worry people tried to disguise as irritation. Ruth sat near the middle with Walter beside her, and her notebook resting closed in her lap. 6 months earlier, many of the same faces had watched her raise a bidder card for 22 old horses and laughed. Now nobody was laughing. A county official stood at the front with a clipboard. He explained what everyone already knew. The next bulk fuel delivery had been delayed again. Emergency reserves would be held for ambulances, road crews, and essential services. Agricultural operations would receive what remained. The room erupted. Everybody had a reason their work could not wait. Calves needed feed. Fruit was ripening. Fields needed planting. Water had to be moved. One man shouted that his operation employed 30 people. Another reminded him that cows did not care how many employees anyone had. Ruth listened. Then Everett Shaw stood. The room quieted faster for him than it had for the county official. Everett owned more acreage than anyone there, more equipment, more storage, more influence. For years, when Everett spoke, people assumed the decision had already been made. He looked toward the front of the room, then toward Ruth. Arguing over the last diesel won't keep everything moving. Someone near the wall muttered, "So what will?" Everett did not answer immediately. His eyes settled on the notebook in Ruth's lap. Let Ruth set the rotation. The room went still. Ruth felt Walter shift slightly beside her. One of the dairy farmers blinked. Someone in the back gave a short laugh, then stopped when nobody joined him. Everett continued, "She knows which teams can handle what. She knows which jobs can be done without fuel. And she's already been turning down money to keep the horses working where they're needed most." Ruth looked at him. There was no apology in his face, no confession, nothing dramatic. Just an acknowledgement he would not have been capable of making 6 months earlier. The county official turned toward Ruth. "Can you do that?" Ruth opened the notebook. Every page carried the same things it had carried for weeks. Names, loads, distances, rest days, canceled jobs, feed requirements, horse condition. She stood. "If we do this," she said, "acreage does not decide priority." A few men shifted uncomfortably. Money doesn't either. Now Everett was the one who did not move. Ruth continued, "Livestock feed first. Water next. Perishable crops after that. Short hauling goes to the teams. Heavy field work that actually requires machinery gets the diesel. Anything that can wait, waits." A farmer near the front frowned. "And who decides what counts as waiting?" Ruth looked down at the notebook. "We do it in the open." That changed the room. Not because everyone agreed. They did not. But because everyone understood the rules would apply to Everett Shaw exactly the same way they applied to a man farming 40 acres. For the next hour, Ruth worked through the list. No speeches, no revenge, just decisions. Dairy feed before lumber. Orchard crates before empty equipment. A fuel allocation for a combine. A horse team for a feed run. A request from Everett's operation was moved down 2 places because the job could wait until afternoon. Everett looked at the list, then nodded. By noon, the parking lot had begun to empty. Outside the cooperative yard, tractors stood in long, silent rows. Across from them, Ruth and Walter harnessed teams for the first routes. The brass hame cap on the chestnut gelding caught the sun. Men who had once watched those horses enter an auction ring as unwanted animals now stood waiting for Ruth to tell them where the teams would go. Ruth looked across the yard. The power had reversed, not because she had more land, not because she had more money, because when one system failed, she still had another one that worked. Then she closed the notebook, handed Walter the first route sheet, and sent the horses out. The fuel trucks returned to Red Hollow on a gray Tuesday morning. Ruth heard them before she saw them. A low diesel rumble rolled across the county road, followed by another, then another. By noon, tractors were starting again. Engines coughed to life behind barns. Loaders moved. Trucks pulled onto the highway. The old familiar noise returned so quickly, it almost felt as if the silence had never happened. Ruth stood outside her barn listening to it. For weeks, her phone had barely stopped ringing. That afternoon, it stayed quiet. For the first time in months, nobody needed her horses. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she found herself wondering whether the county had learned anything at all. 3 days later, Ruth walked into the barn and found Walter standing beside a harness rack with 3 young farmers. One was learning how to check a collar fit. Another was practicing lines with the chestnut team. The third was writing notes. Ruth stopped in the doorway. Walter looked up. They asked. Asked what? How not to forget again. None of them wanted to give up tractors. That was not the point. They wanted to know how to hitch a team safely, how to recognize when a horse was tiring, how to repair old equipment, which jobs animal power could handle, and which ones should stay with machinery. For the first time, Ruth understood that the shortage had not brought the past back. It had only reminded people why keeping more than one kind of knowledge mattered. Later that afternoon, Everett Shaw pulled into the yard. In the back of his truck lay an old horse-drawn cultivator, rusted but mostly complete. "Found it in my grandfather's shed," he said. Ruth looked at the machine. "You keeping it?" Everett shook his head. "Thought somebody ought to know what it's for." Walter gave Ruth a sideways glance. Ruth smiled. "We'll figure it out." That evening, one of the younger farmers finished unharnessing the bay team. Before hanging the gear, he took a cloth and wiped dust from the brass hame cap. Then he placed it carefully back on its peg. Ruth watched without speaking. For years, whenever she remembered her father's horses, the memory ended with 2 empty stalls. It did not end there anymore. Beyond the barn, a tractor crossed the far field, engine steady in the fading light. Closer to the fence, 2 old draft horses walked slowly toward pasture. Neither had replaced the other. That had never been the lesson. The town had mistaken obsolete for useless. Ruth had made a different mistake. She had once believed modern meant invulnerable. The horses had never been the future. They had simply kept one door open when every faster door had closed.